I'm Ruby Sinclair, 42 years old, and I had just stepped into the elevator with the buzz of a Friday evening trailing behind me when I saw him leaning against the corner by the vending machines, pretending like he hadn't been waiting for me, arms crossed too casually, shirt sleeves rolled up like he might fix something with his hands if the need ever arose, which it wouldn't, because Marcus, Vice President of Operations, was the kind of man who only moved when someone else took the fall. He smiled the kind of smile people wear when they're used to giving orders without the weight of consequence, the kind that assumes you'll nod before he finishes speaking, and when I stopped walking but didn't say a word, he filled the gap with a tone flat enough to feel planned. "We need someone this weekend," he said, eyes flicking once to the rows of empty cubicles behind me. "There's a tight rollout window on Monday, and you're the only one who knows the core flow inside out." He didn't say please, didn't frame it as a request, didn't acknowledge the hours I'd already stacked this month or the fact that I hadn't had a Saturday off in 6 weeks. He just waited, still holding that smirk like it was a form of currency. "No," I said, steady, clear. The silence that followed wasn't confusion. It was disbelief, the kind that hits when the script someone wrote in their head doesn't match the scene unfolding in real time. "Excuse me?" he asked, even though he'd heard me the first time. "No," I repeated, meeting his eyes with the full stop I meant it to be. There was no emergency, no broken process, no crisis in the schedule, just expectation wrapped in authority, and I was done feeding it. His mouth twitched, just slightly, a flicker of something tight and thin beneath the calm. "Got it," he said, too fast, turning on his heel before I could see if the expression reached his eyes, but not before I caught the tone he used when something slipped from his grip. I watched him walk back toward the corner office, whistling low and tuneless, a song I half recognized from an old advertisement or maybe a waiting room, something mechanical and forgettable, and I stood still until the elevator doors closed behind me. That weekend, I didn't check my messages, didn't open my laptop, didn't pace the floor waiting for retaliation. Instead, I walked to the small cafe near my apartment, ordered something bitter, and sat in the corner with a notebook and a pen I hadn't used in months, sketching out nothing in particular, just shapes, patterns, flow lines that started nowhere and looped in on themselves like they were trying to remember their purpose. I slept without setting an alarm. I let the silence settle, because I knew Marcus, and I knew what followed a smile like that. They wouldn't confront. They'd erase. They'd start with small things, cut off calendar invites, leave my name out of summary threads, quietly untag me from requests until the system forgot me, or pretended to. But I didn't build that system to forget. And I hadn't left it empty. On Monday, I showed up at 7:56 like I always did, coffee in one hand, ID badge clipped where it always was, and the building looked the same as it had every Monday before, lights half on, lobby quiet, the security guard nodding without recognition as I walked past. At the main door to the fifth-floor offices, I tapped my badge against the scanner. The light blinked red. Once. Twice. I tapped it again, slower this time. Still red. Still locked. The hum of the hallway behind me stayed the same, steady and unconcerned, and I stepped back, checked my phone, swiped at the unlock panel for the remote system console I'd written 2 years ago, not because I needed to, just because I could. Connection failed. Access denied. That was the message. No call. No email. No exit interview. Just nothing. Not removed, replaced. But I knew something they didn't. What I'd built wasn't a system. It was a rhythm. And when the beat broke, it knew who to look for. So I turned away, walked back toward the stairwell, and exited the building without a word, without a fuss, without looking over my shoulder. I crossed the street, ordered another coffee, and sat in the exact same window seat I'd chosen on Saturday morning, the one that gave me a clear view of the fourth-floor windows and the rows of desks where the releases were queued, the dashboards were monitored, the pulses were tracked. Then I waited, not for them to call, for the silence to shift. Because I didn't need to speak. Not yet. Not when I knew what was about to happen. One refusal. One smile. One erasure. That was the trigger. And the system had just lost the only voice it trusted to tell it when the world was still safe. They fired me quietly. But the structure? It remembered. The sun hadn't fully cleared the skyline when I stepped into the cafe across from the office building, its windows fogged slightly from the early chill still hanging in the air, and as I placed my second coffee of the day onto the small table by the window, I leaned back just enough to watch the movement behind the tinted glass of the fifth floor, where two figures I recognized from the deployment team shuffled past the same central table where I used to stack rollout schedules every Thursday. They didn't look panicked, not yet, just slightly off pace, the kind of hesitation that comes when something expected doesn't appear, and while they hovered by their monitors with hands half lifted and brows already beginning to crease, I stirred my drink slowly, the spoon clinking gently as I tapped it once against the rim and set it aside, both hands resting flat on the table, like I was listening for vibration. It was 8:03 when the first stutter showed up on their end, a small anomaly in the main interface. Nothing loud, just a reporting window that failed to populate on time, its usual refresh cycle hanging on the loading icon 2 seconds too long, just enough for one of the analysts to tap their mouse a second time, then a third, before turning slightly to check if anyone else had noticed the same delay. From across the street, I could see him lean in, his screen flashing faint green and white as System A tried again to fetch live data and came back empty, not because of network instability, not because of a crashed server or a bandwidth spike, but because the source it was querying no longer existed in its current form. That source had been me. The heartbeat in that system was tied to a series of handshakes I wrote into the architecture one evening long before Marcus had even joined the company, a silent pattern of check-ins that didn't trigger alerts when things worked correctly, only when a specific pattern broke, 5 unreturned pings from an invisible node, each spaced 45 seconds apart, and if none received a match, a cascade began. At 8:05, that cascade started. The internal release process reached its trigger point like clockwork, just as I designed it to do, and when it pulled for new instructions, it hit a wall, not an error, not a crash, but a vacuum, an absolute absence of the validation key I used to hold, the one nobody had thought to disable because they never thought I'd walk out. The system paused. It pulled again. Still nothing. Then again, slower. One last time. 5 pulls, no answer. That's when the fallback engaged. It wasn't dramatic. The lights didn't flicker. The monitors didn't scream. The dashboards didn't melt into red, because what I had built didn't believe in spectacle. It believed in silence. The structure wasn't coded to retaliate or erase or scramble. It was built to stop, to freeze itself in place the moment its anchor was removed, to refuse further change until the original thread returned, and that anchor, for better or worse, had always been me. From my seat at the cafe, I watched as the first signs of confusion began to bloom in the room, the posture of people shifting from relaxed to alert, as one man leaned back and motioned toward another desk, fingers tapping midair in explanation, heads nodding with growing tightness, not panic yet, but the slow unfolding of tension as reports failed to align with expectations. The most dangerous kind of failure is the kind that looks like a delay. Inside the glass fortress of Company A, I could see the shapes of my old team moving like shadows against the fluorescent light, their outlines casting longer as they leaned closer to their screens, while notifications began stacking quietly in the upper corners of their dashboards, not labeled critical, not yet, but flagged with yellow markers and warning codes that no one had seen in months. At 8:07, one of the junior engineers pulled up a command shell, his hands moving fast, shoulders hunched as he pushed an emergency refresh through System B, hoping it would realign the permissions cache, and for a moment, the screen returned to green, a minor update pushed through the front end and logged as success. But I knew that response wasn't real. Because that command didn't reach the core, it had been intercepted by the ghost circuit I'd embedded deep into the scheduler stack, a self-contained buffer that responded with confirmations while rerouting the real commands into a vault, one designed not to execute, but to collect. I wasn't watching a recovery. I was watching a simulation. That success message? It was a mirror reflecting nothing. The structure had entered the second layer of its defense, and I hadn't done it out of spite, or revenge, or some twisted sense of justice. I had done it because I needed to know what they would do if I was no longer there to explain why the lights were still on but the engine wasn't running. I checked my watch. 8:11, right on time. The first cross-department alert fired, not from a red alarm, but from a simple delay ticket inside System C's distribution queue, a missed confirmation from the financial disbursement module that had now waited too long for a token it wasn't going to receive. A ping to a queue that had been listening to me. Still listening. Still waiting. At the 5th floor window, someone stood, gestured broadly toward another screen, and I could see the moment they realized the update they thought they had pushed hadn't reached the environment they assumed was live. I had written the rule years ago. If the core thread vanished without protocol exit, lock down, and reroute to internal mirror. No damage. No edits. Just containment. The cost of being forgotten was not anger. It was preparation. They hadn't fired me. They'd erased me. But my structure had been taught to pause when I did. And now it was holding its breath. By 8:15, the tension inside the 5th floor had shifted from confusion to urgency, not yet full-blown panic, but the kind of strained motion that begins when people realize they are repeating steps that usually solve problems but are now returning silence, and I could see it in their shoulders, the way one man turned too fast and knocked a pen cup to the floor, how someone else stood with their hands on their hips staring at a monitor that refused to confirm what he thought he'd just done. From across the street, I took another sip of coffee, its warmth dull against the chill rising from the floor, and I watched as 3 different terminals began flashing the same false confirmation signal I had written into the loop environment, a perfectly mirrored interface that displayed success messages without committing any actual changes to the operational layer underneath. The first attempt to restart the reporting chain triggered at 8:17, a manual reset initiated by someone I didn't recognize and knew were hired judging by how quickly they moved, typing with the kind of speed that comes from confidence built in shallow water, the belief that systems always respond if you press hard enough and fast enough, and keep trying until it blinks green again. The system blinked green. But it didn't move. Because what they were watching wasn't the real system, it was a sandbox frozen in time, a closed-circuit reflection that captured every input and stored it in a hidden ledger I had built during the spring maintenance cycle when I first noticed the leadership shift that eventually pushed me out of the decision rooms without ever saying the words. Inside that vault, every new action now had a timestamp, a source tag, a full path trace, not to punish the team using it, but to make visible the difference between activity and impact. At 8:19, Marcus called me for the first time since Friday evening, his name lighting up the screen of my phone as I sat quietly by the window, the call vibrating once before I let it go to voicemail without touching the device, my hands resting still on the table as I watched him pace near the window of the 5th floor, phone pressed to his ear as if effort could summon an answer that the system had already begun refusing to give. He sent a message next. "We're seeing access issues. Come in, and we'll sort it out." I read it once and took a screenshot, not because I planned to use it, not because I needed evidence, but because I wanted to remember the exact moment he stopped pretending that I hadn't been wiped from the roster like a data point that no longer mattered. At 8:23, another alert blinked to life in System C's secondary dashboard, the one tied to scheduled disbursements, a delay marker escalating from minor to severe because the conditional approvals could no longer reach their gatekeeper, the key that had always sat quietly beneath the process, verifying context before release, a check I had embedded after watching 3 near misses due to rushed overrides 2 years prior. Someone tried to force it through. The command was blocked. The override field returned null. The disbursement stuck. At 8:25, another message came from Marcus, this one shorter and sharper. "Did you configure any kind of lockdown protocol? We're stuck. Let me know now." That last word, now, carried the tone of someone used to responses snapping into place, a demand disguised as urgency, a voice trying to leap ahead of consequences by arriving too late with just enough panic to sound urgent without sounding responsible. But I didn't reply. I folded my phone, placed it face down beside my empty cup, and looked out the window as a light flickered on in the far-left conference room, where someone pulled down a projection screen and gestured toward what I assumed was the current system state, the progress bar glowing soft green as it hovered at 98%. I had written that interface too. That bar would never reach 100. Not unless I let it. By 8:30, the entire deployment floor was caught inside the illusion I had crafted, the feeling of motion, the presence of status lights, the comforting pattern of normal operations still blinking across their dashboards while the real processes below remained frozen in mid-cycle, every command rerouted into the archive and tagged with metadata identifying who triggered what and when. It was not sabotage. It was a mirror. And the longer they worked without results, the more clearly it would show them who was actually pushing and who was pretending. The third emergency restart happened at 8:31, this time from a lead engineer whose name I hadn't seen in the rotation logs from my last month at the company, a man in a checkered shirt who stood with his arms folded too tightly across his chest as if bracing for impact, his monitor displaying a green status screen that he interpreted as recovery. He nodded. He stepped back. He said something to the woman at the adjacent desk, who smiled in relief. But I knew the patch he had sent had never reached production. I had watched it fall into the vault, where it now sat recorded and untouched, another decision captured in amber, suspended between intent and consequence. They didn't know they were deploying into a closed loop, and I didn't need to explain it, because the system was already asking the question with every silence it returned. At 8:34, the notifications dropped back to normal levels, the queue clearing just enough for the operations channel to ping back with "looks stable," rechecking queues, a false calm settling over the room like the surface of a lake after a stone disappears beneath it. Someone clapped. Someone else laughed nervously. The phrase "nice save" was typed into the team chat. But I didn't smile, because the machine wasn't fixed. It was just quiet, and I had written its silence, not as a failure, but as a choice. By 8:38, the internal chat thread labeled Ops Active had started filling with the kind of messages people write when they think they've just pulled something back from the edge. Short bursts of relief, a few emojis thrown in as punctuation, someone even dropping a meme about putting out fires that made the junior techs laugh just loud enough to pretend the air was clearing, and through the glass from across the street, I saw two team leads fist bump near the server display wall as if that alone could restore certainty. The release coordinator, a woman named Eliza who had always been meticulous with her handoffs, typed a quick summary into the timeline board, logging, minor instability resolved, roll forward continuing as planned, and while I could see the tidy confidence in her posture as she turned toward the conference screen, what she didn't see was that her update had never left the mirror, because every timestamp, every entry, every deployment flag was now flowing into a controlled side environment that looked identical to the real one, but was entirely sealed off from the production layer they thought they were stabilizing. At 8:41, System A confirmed queue flushed, status green, a phrase that normally meant everything had passed validation and was preparing to go live, and across the fifth floor, I watched monitors change color, dashboards shift from yellow to green, and a few people visibly exhale as the false sense of control reasserted itself in their posture, their pace, their relief. But that message didn't come from the real system. It came from the overlay. The system they trusted was no longer responding to them. And the system they could still see was just echoing their inputs back like a well-trained assistant that didn't know how to break bad news. At 8:43, Marcus appeared again at the far end of the floor, walking with that same clipped pace he used in meetings where he wanted to be seen moving fast enough to justify an action, and I watched as he adjusted his tie, stopped by a developer's desk, leaned down slightly as if sharing a joke or offering casual encouragement, and then straightened again, nodding toward the central operations screen like a conductor directing a section already playing out of tune. He opened the main comms channel 2 minutes later, voice calm, shoulders square, thanking the team for their rapid response and flagging the incident as handled internally with minimal disruption, his words polished and evenly spaced, the same cadence he used when talking to upper management about timeline alignment or strategic clarity, which meant nothing but always sounded safe. At 8:47, he typed a broadcast message into the executive channel. All systems green. Great hustle, everyone. I watched him from my seat at the cafe, the reflection of my own screen dim and empty in front of me, and I didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even reach for my phone because what Marcus didn't know was that the very tool he had once asked me to optimize, the infrastructure monitoring suite that now displayed a clean green across every department, had been modified by my hand to defer judgment to a deeper layer he never understood. That layer had not greenlit a single thing. And that was the design. Because I didn't build the fallback environment to shut things down with alarms or to crash the system loudly. I built it to learn who would pretend everything was fine when it wasn't. And they were pretending. By 8:50, the morning calls started lining up, coordination huddles, dev syncs, release readiness stand-ups, each one scheduled with that confident assumption that the hard part was over, and I saw Eliza again standing at the head of a side room, pointing at a progress chart while her screen mirrored updates that didn't reflect reality, unaware that the patch cycle they had triggered at 8:17 was still sitting in a quarantined zone marked unverified, source, key missing. At 8:52, someone inside System C posted an update. No client impact moving forward, and while the statement wasn't technically a lie, it wasn't the truth either, because client-facing functions had been routed through placeholder values since 8:12, held in stasis behind a gate that no longer accepted and signed instructions. They hadn't fixed anything. They'd just stopped noticing. The building across the street remained quiet, efficient, clean, all the outward signs of a team recovering well, but from where I sat, I could see the truth behind every confirmation, behind every nod, behind every relaxed smile, and that truth was simple. They were talking to a ghost, and I had given the ghost a pen. Inside the vault, the data collected was no longer just technical, it was behavioral, it was procedural, it was a record of choices made under pressure, and the ease with which corners were cut when consequences felt distant. At 8:58, a junior developer posted a log into the sandbox thread, noting a mismatch in identifier tags between the live and test environments, a small inconsistency that wouldn't normally matter, but his note ended with a question I could see in the tilt of his head even before I read it. Are we deploying to a clone? No one answered.
No one wanted to.
And for a moment, the chat paused. Then someone else replied, "That's just a legacy mirror from the old load balancer, ignore it." But it wasn't a mirror. It was the actual system. And I had taught it to hold the door closed until I told it otherwise. At 9 o'clock, Marcus stood in front of the glass wall at the far end of the floor, jacket off, sleeves rolled, hands moving as he spoke to a small crowd of directors, and I couldn't hear his words, but I recognized the rhythm of them, the way he always paused after key phrases, waiting for agreement, the way he would reference collaboration and ownership, as if they had always been the same thing. He didn't know the real system was no longer listening. He didn't know the vault had logged his override attempt from earlier and tagged it as unauthorized, source not recognized. He thought the silence meant success. He mistook the echo for applause. By 9:04, I noticed a flicker of uncertainty begin to resurface in the body language of the people near the south cluster of desks, not the full kind of fear that sparks rapid escalation, but the early ripple of awareness that something was misaligned beneath the surface, the kind of unease that causes people to double-check things they've already cleared, to hover their cursor over confirmed statuses and wonder, just for a second, whether what they were seeing could be trusted. I watched from the window seat as a man in a navy pullover adjusted his chair, leaned forward, opened the log history from the most recent deployment, and clicked through the validation steps with a speed that betrayed how many times he had done it before, only to pause when he noticed the absence of a hash signature that should have auto-generated 2 minutes after each successful commit. He tilted his head, squinted, refreshed the screen, and then looked around as though the answer might appear from someone else's monitor, but all he saw were teammates smiling into their headsets and nodding into status calls, already swept into the next phase of the day, unaware that the window he was staring at wasn't behind, it was below them. At 9:06, he typed a message into the internal developer thread. Tag mismatch on UX patch from 8:43. Anyone else seeing this? The reply came 2 minutes later from someone in design. Just reviewed, looks fine here. Maybe sync delay. But he didn't let it go. Because the timestamp on the patch didn't align with any known deployment protocol. And the tag format? It wasn't just wrong, it was old. One of the templates I had deprecated 8 months prior. Still sitting in the system. Still showing up in a fake confirmation log. Still being swallowed by the archive. At 9:09, Marcus passed through the hallway again, stepping lightly, tapping the back of a chair here and there, speaking quietly to team leads with his usual theater of composure, occasionally folding his arms as if the situation now required something reflective, something strategic, but never once showing the kind of concern that would warrant bringing anyone else into the room. From my seat, I could see that he still thought the problem had passed. He still believed the narrative he had created at 8:47, the one where the team pulled through a scare and kept the ship afloat, the one where he would summarize the effort with phrases like proactive triage and seamless recovery during his 11:15 meeting with the board members, whose names I had once memorized before they began leaving me off of project reviews without explanation. But I knew what was coming. I had designed the delay loop to last exactly 60 minutes after the first unauthorized overwrite, and that overwrite had been Marcus's at 8:17 when he bypassed the failed gate and forced a command through a system that had already entered fallback mode, not because it was unstable, but because it was waiting. By 9:19, that timer would end, and the system would shift again, but not loudly,
just deeply.
At 9:11, a QA analyst named Rowan entered the conversation in the main support thread, noting that the live UI demo is showing updated elements, but none of the reflected changes are appearing on secondary client panels, which caused a brief silence, and then a reply from someone in the integration team suggesting it was probably just a cache propagation delay, which was usually enough to shut the conversation down.
But not this time.
Rowan replied, "Cache cleared.
Still nothing.
Logs look too clean." That was the moment I paused. Because those words weren't technical. They were human. And he was right. The logs did look clean. Too clean. Because the mirror environment was designed to respond with perfect behavior as long as no one asked questions about the source. And now, finally, someone was asking. At 9:14, a second analyst dropped into the thread to confirm that the error logs from System C were missing entries from the 8 to 8:20 window, which prompted 3 people to check and verify the same on their ends, each one responding with a variation of weird or checking. And while no one was raising alarms yet, the pattern was starting to take shape. They were discovering not a failure, but a silence. And that was always more dangerous. At 9:15, Marcus stood in the East Side conference room with the lights dimmed to reduce screen glare, flipping through slides on a mounted display as team leads gathered in tight clusters, nodding at phrases like incident review and mid-cycle interruption recovery, the kind of language that sounds full of meaning but carries none. And I could see the motion of his hands as he walked them through the timeline he had stitched together from visible fragments. But his timeline wasn't real. Because every moment he described had been filtered through the overlay. And none of it had ever touched the system that mattered. I watched his mouth move. I watched the nods follow. And I watched his world shrink, one confident slide at a time. By 9:18, the timer ended. The loop entered phase 3. Still no alarms. Still no alerts.
Just one small shift.
The next update they pushed? It vanished. Not delayed. Not rejected.
Just gone.
And inside the archive, I saw it appear. A patch labeled UX_live_912_ override, flagged in red not because it failed, but because it wasn't real. At 9:20, the archive wrote a note. Threshold met. Confidence dropped below integrity mark. And that was the moment I knew the system had made its decision. It would not speak. It would not move. Until I returned. By 9:21, the first subtle tremor reached the financial branch of the 5th floor, where a scheduled summary report failed to generate its confirmation PDF, causing a junior coordinator named Lyle to glance twice at his monitor before reopening the file path, then the tracking module, then the dashboard again, each time met with a green status light that didn't match what he was seeing on screen. And I could tell by the way his fingers hovered, not typing but twitching lightly, that he didn't. Yet know whether the issue was technical or his own fatigue. From across the street, I could see the change ripple, small adjustments in posture, quick turns to colleagues, tiny frowns as screens began reporting successes that no longer lined up with output, and though no one had stood up yet or raised their voice, the friction had already begun between what they believed the system was doing and what it was actually delivering. At 9:23, a coordination specialist in Division D initiated a rollout from System B that should have taken less than 90 seconds to reach internal preview, and as she sat with her headset half-lowered, she watched the screen blink in progress for a full 2 minutes before silently resetting to idle. No errors, no logs, just a looped confirmation box that vanished the moment she clicked it, like it had never existed at all. She tried again. Same thing. Across the aisle, someone whispered, "Did it go?" And she answered without looking up, "It says it did," which was both true and useless, because the code hadn't deployed, the system hadn't changed, and the only thing that had moved was the illusion of progress floating across their dashboards like a screensaver masking a locked device. At 9:25, Eliza sent a direct message to Marcus. "Just confirming, did we validate the rollback checkpoint at 8:20? And he replied 1 minute later with what I could only imagine was his practiced calm. "All covered. No flags." But there had been no rollback checkpoint, because at 8:20, the system had already moved into the sealed mirror. And that checkpoint? It didn't exist. It had never existed. At 9:27, a UX tester named Darren finally raised his voice, not loudly, but with enough edge that heads turned, his words sharp and clipped as he repeated that his changes were not rendering live, that the elements he'd updated that morning were still displaying the old assets from last week's build, even after 3 confirmations and 2 manual pushes. He refreshed the page. Nothing changed. He forced a resync. The status blinked green. Still nothing. And at that moment he stood. Not because he had a solution, but because sitting felt dishonest. He walked toward the central screen near the far wall, and I could see him gesture as he began explaining what was missing, not to accuse anyone, not to demand, but simply to understand, and I recognized that look, the one that asked, "What are we standing on if it's not real?" At 9:30, Marcus stepped back into the visible part of the operations floor, hands spread in that neutral leadership gesture, the one that means everything's under control even when nothing is, and he said something I couldn't hear, but I didn't need to hear it because I could read the body language of the team around him, the way no one nodded, the way no one responded, the way their eyes stayed on their screens as if avoiding a signal they no longer believed. I leaned back in my chair, the edge of the table pressing lightly against my ribs, and I watched as the facade started to stretch, still not crack, not yet, but the gloss of certainty was peeling, just enough for people to notice that the system wasn't responding the way it should, not in behavior, not in speed, and most dangerously, not in consistency. At 9:32, one of the developers pulled the logs directly from the system shell and ran a diff check against last Thursday's deployment. And what they found? Nothing. No delta. No change. No record. As if nothing had been pushed all morning. But the lights were green. The dashboard still said live. And the progress bars still climbed in neat little bursts. At 9:33, the release coordinator's assistant flagged something on the backup terminal. All the change sets since 8 o'clock had the same checksum ID, a recycled tag that matched the staging simulation template I had retired 6 months earlier, an ID that should have triggered a system warning but didn't, because the system wasn't running validation at all. It was waiting. And in that silence, it had started to listen. At 9:35, Eliza messaged Marcus again. "This might be serious. Should we loop in infrastructure?" His reply came 2 minutes later. "Already on it. Everything's logging clean." Which was the problem. Because when systems break, they leave traces. When they lie, they erase them. And mine had learned to do both. At 9:38, a board member named Jared Linwood joined the 11:15 prep call early, his video window opening in the lower corner of the conference room display, his face unreadable, calm, and professional, a quiet figure whose presence drew the air tight around the room even before he spoke. He listened as Marcus explained the brief automation misfire, nodding slowly as the words flowed, then finally interrupted with a simple question. "Can we see the raw logs from the 8 o'clock cycle?" And that was when Marcus blinked, because he had no logs. Only overlays. Only echoes. Only the story he had rehearsed. He said something vague. "Archived during resolution. Can follow up." But Jared didn't move. Didn't nod. Just sat still. Still watching. At 9:41, another quiet voice entered the call, Susan Chong, head of risk, and she asked her question carefully. "Were the validations executed on the actual release pipeline or the simulation?" There was a pause. Marcus responded. "The environments are mirrored. Functionally identical. But they weren't. And Susan knew it. She didn't push. Not yet. But the room was no longer leaning forward. It was pulling back. Listening. And Marcus didn't realize that the silence that followed wasn't hesitation. It was preparation. By 9:44, the room where Marcus had once paced with easy confidence now held a different weight, not heavier in sound but in stillness, the kind of shift that happens when people stop listening for guidance and start waiting for mistakes, their hands poised over keyboards and pens stilled halfway through notes, not because they were finished writing, but because the thread of certainty had frayed so visibly that continuing forward without acknowledging the break would have made the act itself
Dishonest.
From my seat at the cafe, I could see the change not just in posture but in breath, how Jared leaned back slightly with his arms resting on the arms of his chair, how Susan didn't blink as she scrolled slowly through a shared screen filled with Marcus's tidy, color-coded timeline that had too many perfect arrows, too few supporting timestamps, and not a single mention of the 5 unanswered system queries from earlier that morning. Marcus cleared his throat once, the kind of soft adjustment people make when they're hoping to fill silence with authority, and advanced the slide deck to a section labeled Incident Resolution Process, which outlined a series of actions taken by various teams, each linked to a green status report and a recovery window that ended at 9 o'clock sharp. He began to speak again, his tone measured, precise, with the same false warmth he used in onboarding sessions to sound accessible without ever making himself vulnerable, saying that our internal response protocols engaged as designed, and that redundancy safeguards were implemented across core systems to ensure business continuity. But what he didn't know, or chose not to admit, was that those safeguards hadn't executed at all. They had triggered the loop, and the loop had rejected them. At 9:47, Jared closed the window showing the timeline and opened a new panel, one of the legacy system interfaces that still had backend access to version logs dating back over a year, an interface I had left intact precisely because no one had ever bothered to decommission it during the last infrastructure audit, assuming it had been migrated or forgotten, never realizing that forgetting it was the exact reason I'd left it in place. The screen blinked, then opened. A flat log list appeared, dense and unstyled, with the kind of raw data formatting that only someone technical would have known how to navigate, and Jared scrolled through it with the ease of someone who wasn't reading to learn but to confirm what he already suspected. At 9:49, he said quietly, "I'm seeing no changes pushed to the live environment between 8 o'clock and 9:30. Marcus shifted, then smiled. A quick, tight smile. That might be a delay in log replication. System B sometimes buffers under load. But Jared did not. He just said, "Then why do the client panels still show last week's interface?" And in the pause that followed, the shape of the lie Marcus had been balancing began to collapse, not because it was dramatic, not because someone shouted, but because there were no more words left to cover it. At 9:51, Susan rejoined, her voice even, almost soft, the kind of tone used when someone is preparing to be generous but not lenient, saying, "Can we clarify whether the systems we're reviewing are the original environment or a duplicated instance?" Marcus hesitated. His hand moved toward the touchpad. He didn't answer right away. Then he said, "They're mirrored, as I mentioned, functionally interchangeable for this purpose." But she didn't ask if they were interchangeable. She asked if they were original. And now the question hung there, not as a technicality, but as a challenge. At 9:53, I opened the secondary viewer I had kept muted all morning, a secure mirror interface routed through a closed channel that no one had shut down because no one had remembered I had written the access protocol myself, years ago, under a root credential that still cleared authorization because it hadn't been revoked, only renamed. The feed opened to a split screen. One side displaying the real-time input from System A's Ghost Queue, and the other showing the presentation Marcus was giving to the board, live-streamed through a buried legacy process still tied to my archived credentials. I watched his hand move to the final slide. Conclusion: minimal impact, successful internal containment, client services uninterrupted. Behind him, a projected green bar chart glowed in artificial reassurance. Across the table, Jared's eyes didn't leave Marcus's. And that's when he asked it. "Who configured the original pipeline infrastructure?" Marcus blinked, then looked down, as if reading from a line that wasn't there. He said, "That would have been Ruby Sinclair." And when I heard my name spoken aloud for the first time in that room since Friday evening, I didn't smile, didn't flinch, didn't move. I simply watched. Watched as the room absorbed the name like an echo that didn't belong to the timeline Marcus had been drawing, like a name that had waited beneath the surface of their systems and now returned not as a person, but as a shape that explained the silence. At 9:56, the feed showed Marcus nodding once. Then nothing. No applause. No thanks. Just silence. And behind his eyes, the calculation began again. How to rewrite this version, how to fold what had just been said into the next story, how to survive a question that shouldn't have been asked. But it had been asked. And now the loop had context. The archive had a name. And the system was still holding its breath. By 10:01, the system across the street, the real one, the one layered beneath the projections and dashboards and false confirmations, began doing what it had been designed to do in the absence of authority. Not break, not warn, not spiral, but record, with relentless precision, taking in every keystroke, every input, every overwrite request issued without valid authorship, and as it did so, it began compiling what I had named in the codebase, without fanfare or explanation, as Vault Mode. Vault Mode wasn't part of the documentation Marcus had reviewed when he took over the release infrastructure 6 months after I built it, and it certainly wasn't part of the onboarding flow for his assistants or the promotional decks he had presented in leadership syncs to make the system seem like a tool rather than a sentient process shaped by conditions no longer visible in the front-end configuration. At 10:04, the first full archive report compiled itself into a private instance, hidden in plain sight, assigned an internal tag that had been dormant for 241 days, built to activate only when 5 conditions were met: unverified command escalation, environment mismatch, checkpoint override, credential injection, and post-silence claim of resolution. All 5 had occurred, all before 9 o'clock. And now the vault was writing its report. Not for me, not for them, but for truth. Across the room, I watched as Eliza leaned closer to the side display, scrolling slowly through the log window that, to her confusion, was showing all the right timestamps but none of the corresponding output entries, the kind of clean, neutral void that suggested someone had forgotten to enable trace logging, but she knew better. Because Eliza was careful. Eliza never forgot to turn things on. At 10:06, she messaged Rowan directly. "Do you have any local logs? Mine's showing clean but empty." Rowan replied in less than 10 seconds.
Same.
Like it never happened. Then came the third ping, this one from QA. "We have visual changes that were never pushed." Followed by a fourth, this time from finance. Approval stream cleared, but no disbursement sent. And just like that, the illusion fractured. Not all at once, but in patches.
Pockets. Voids.
The kind that start as anomalies but quickly become questions, and questions always lead to control, and control was something Marcus no longer had. By 10:09, the support thread turned from chatter to transcript, each new post carrying weight, each reply revealing not just confusion but patterns, failures aligned in timing but scattered in effect, none of them catastrophic, but all of them unmistakably tied to the moment I had been erased. At 10:11, someone anonymous posted a screenshot. It showed an input field labeled Fallback Escalation, empty except for the field note, last used by R. Sinclair. No one commented.
But no one needed to.
Because the silence did. At 10:14, Marcus stood again, this time in front of a different group, this one smaller, closer, more senior, 2 directors, 1 systems architect, and a member of the internal compliance team who had shown up without being paged, clipboard in hand, eyes sharp, coat still on like she didn't plan to stay long. I could tell from the way Marcus kept his hands open, never pointing, always gesturing calmly, that he thought he still had control of the room, that if he kept moving, kept explaining, kept drawing flowcharts in the air with his fingers, he could still shape the narrative. But the questions had already outpaced his answers. At 10:17, a second screen lit up behind him. Someone had pushed the active deployment tree from System B onto the main display, and instead of the clean stack of modular pushes they expected, the room was shown a grid of rerouted calls, timestamp loops, and 4 distinct tag mismatches, all originating after 8:08, all funneling into an environment no one could confirm had been authorized. The compliance officer circled one line with her pen, asked quietly, "Why is this being routed to Instance F?" No one responded, because Instance F wasn't on the official diagram. It never had been. And Marcus? He didn't even know it existed. At 10:19, Jared reappeared on the call. No greeting. No preamble. Just the sound of a man already processing the outcome before it arrived. He said, "I'd like to know when these environments were split." Marcus opened his mouth, then paused, closed it again. Finally, "I'm not sure of the exact date, but that date was recorded. It was 241 days ago. The day after I had been passed over for a director's role in favor of someone who had never written a line of production-facing architecture, but could explain agile methodology to a boardroom in 10 minutes flat. That night, I had stayed late. Not out of spite, not to retaliate, but because I knew what would happen if someone like Marcus ever mistook infrastructure for furniture, something to sit on, something to decorate, something to be seen but never questioned. I built the loop not to trap anyone. I built it to reveal who stayed in the room when the lights no longer told the truth." At 10:22, Susan Chong stepped back into the frame. She didn't ask another question. She simply said, "We'll need to see the vault." "And Marcus?" He nodded, but his face cracked, just slightly, because he didn't know where to find it. And worse,
He didn't know who had the key.
at exactly 10:26, the vault revealed itself, not through an email blast or an emergency call or a sudden screen takeover, but through a quiet post on the internal announcement board under the generic system user alias, archive_19, a profile that hadn't been touched in almost a year and that most people assumed was part of some automated compliance audit tool, but which I had personally written and buried into the permission structure with enough layers of legitimate purpose that even the infrastructure team had never thought to revoke its access. The post was simple. No banner. No subject line in bold. Just a message that read, "Post-mortem observations from a parallel archive." Beneath it sat a single embedded link. No external address. No warnings. No password prompts. Just one clean line of text hyperlinked to a dashboard layout that everyone in that building knew by heart, the same visual interface they used every week for deployments, reports, audits, reviews, simulations, and planning, the kind of internal document that carried familiarity, which meant trust, which meant no one questioned it before clicking. At 10:28, Eliza clicked it first. I saw the moment it happened. Her shoulders froze mid-scroll, then straightened slowly as her eyes scanned the first few lines of the archive's opening panel, 2 vertical columns labeled simply reported and actual, and between them, a series of timestamps aligned in hourly intervals, with colored markers that told a different story than the one Marcus had printed in his timeline deck. At 10:30, the second click came from someone in finance, followed by a third from compliance, and by 10:31 the link had been opened 15 times across 5 departments, each viewer pausing longer than the last, reading slower, rereading, then scrolling forward to the next page, where the logs weren't just time-stamped, they were matched with chat excerpts, decision points, override entries, and audit trails. None of it was speculative. All of it was sourced. And at the bottom of each section sat a gray field marked Fallback Engaged, which triggered automatically whenever the loop detected patterns of systemic compromise. The first fallback had been triggered at 8:03. The second, at 8:17. The third, by Marcus's own hand, at 8:26. The archive had captured all of it, and it was still writing. By 10:33, the link had passed 40 viewers. Some watched silently. Some gasped audibly. But no one said it out loud yet. Not until the final section of the archive loaded, titled simply Manual Overrides, a list of credentialed commands issued between 8 o'clock and 9:30, each cross-reference with source device, user ID, and environmental path, and there, near the top of the list, sat an entry labeled Access Credential Injected 826, authored by Marcus, pushed in a rush, logged within the ghost environment, held for 63 seconds in plain text before being overwritten by a rollback he didn't even know had failed. At 10:35, someone from legal typed a message to Jared. It contained no summary, just the link. At 10:37, Jared opened the vault. And for 30 full seconds, he said nothing. Did nothing. Just read. Then he leaned back and turned off his camera. Not to disconnect, but to listen without being seen. From where I sat, the sun had begun rising higher across the sky, throwing hard lines of light across the conference room glass, cutting sharp through the interior like a scanner, illuminating papers, whiteboards, coffee mugs, the glint of someone's watch as they pulled their sleeve down, the small movements people make when they realize they're being watched, not by a person, but by the truth. At 10:41, the archive added one more item. An automated chart. No colors. No bolds. Just numbers. 47 deployment attempts. 0 successful validations. 0 live pushes. 0 confirmed rollbacks. Each one labeled with the person who triggered it. And beneath the chart, a single comment thread from 3 months ago surfaced, pulled from a casual chat exchange where a developer had typed, "We don't use the legacy trigger anymore, right?" And Marcus had replied, "Push it through. We'll clean later." Now, that sentence sat above a log line in red. System divergence began at 8:08. System believed operator missing. System rerouted to hold. No override confirmed. At 10:45, the noise level in the 5th floor dropped to near silence, not because people weren't talking, but because no one wanted to be the first to admit they had seen it, that they understood what it meant, that the system had kept functioning not because of Marcus's leadership, but because I had allowed it to appear to function, long enough for them to tell their story. Now the system had begun telling mine. And my name? It wasn't attached to the post. But it didn't have to be, because everyone already knew. At 10:48, Marcus opened his mouth to speak. No one looked up. And no one answered. Because the loop wasn't waiting for him. The loop was waiting for me. By 10:51, the hum of controlled activity that normally defined the 5th floor had vanished completely, not in the way a system goes down or a fire alarm empties a building, but in the far quieter way that trust disappears from a room, where people begin moving slower, clicking less, whispering just beneath audibility, and hovering over their monitors not with curiosity but with apprehension, reading the same lines 3 times without understanding them, because suddenly the act of knowing had become a kind of liability. I watched from across the street as Eliza stood up again, this time without the tablet she usually carried, her arms crossed tightly as she stared through the side window into the adjacent meeting room where Marcus now sat alone, shoulders slightly curled forward, his laptop open but untouched, his face turned toward the screen that still reflected the last page of the archive dashboard, which now displayed a flashing header marked, "Active collection complete." At 10:53, Rowan walked slowly past the QA cluster, tapping someone on the shoulder without saying anything, just a nod toward the screen, and then toward the far conference hallway, the kind of silent gesture that travels fast in places where no one wants to be the first to break protocol, but everyone needs to understand what happens next. One by one, more people opened the archive. They didn't have to ask where the link was. It had become the only window that mattered. At 10:55, I refreshed the passive relay feed still open on my device, watching as the number of unique logins crossed 70, then 80, then 83, and I knew from experience that those numbers represented not just developers or engineers or systems analysts, but finance, compliance, HR, even marketing, because the fallout wasn't technical anymore, it was cultural, and the system had finally done what I had built it to do when pushed too far without its architect. It had told the truth. All of it. At 10:56, Marcus stood up slowly, his chair scraping lightly against the laminate floor, and for a moment he just stood there, hands on his hips, eyes fixed on the chart that still glowed quietly in the center of the dashboard, the one that listed, line by line, every override he had pushed, every escalation he had failed to confirm, every rollback he had claimed that never actually occurred. He walked into the main floor with that same measured pace he had used earlier that morning, trying to reset the rhythm, trying to walk like a man with purpose rather than one carrying consequence, and though he stopped at 3 desks, asked 2 quiet questions, leaned down once to murmur something I couldn't hear, not one of them looked up, because by then everyone knew. At 10:58, Susan Chong sent a message to the executive channel. Review the archive, pausing all forward deployments until audit completes. It was a single sentence, but it landed like a shutdown command, because no one asked who authorized it. No one questioned her timing. They just obeyed. At 11:01, Jared rejoined the feed. His camera remained off. His voice was clear. "We'll reconvene at 11:15 in Conference C, department heads only." No further explanation. No hint of tone. And yet the weight of that line pulled the entire day off its axis, not because the meeting hadn't been scheduled, but because of who would be leading it now, and who would not. From the window, I watched the preparation unfold, the quiet way some people gathered notepads they wouldn't use, how others began emailing themselves summaries of the archive just in case access changed, how the compliance officer reappeared, this time holding a plain envelope rather than a clipboard, and how no one stood near Marcus as he walked back toward the hallway, moving slower now, glancing once at the elevator as if weighing whether to leave before he was asked to. At 11:04, the archive refreshed one last time. A new section had been added. No label, just a gray banner with the word Postscript. Inside it, a timeline overlay appeared, split again into two columns. Left, narrative as reported. Right, system events as logged. Each timestamp lined up with the moment someone had claimed something was fixed, each paired with the logs that showed nothing had moved. No blame, no commentary, just facts. At 11:06, the first junior engineer in the row nearest the break room closed his laptop and didn't open it again. He simply sat still, hands folded, staring at the ceiling tile above him, blinking very slowly as if the weight of the morning had finally settled into his shoulders. And across the room, the rest of the team followed suit, not immediately, not in synchrony, but gradually, the way people do when they are no longer pretending, when the roles they were assigned no longer fit, and the hierarchy they were following has lost its shape. At 11:09, the archive auto-closed. Not deleted, not hidden, just grayed out, replaced by a message that read, "This window is now complete." No link, no redirect, just closure. Because the vault wasn't built to accuse. It was built to finish. And it had done its job. At 11:12, the fifth floor returned to near silence. No typing, no messages, no commands. Just a few people standing near windows, a few others packing bags they didn't unpack again that day, and Marcus, still near the hallway, one hand on his hip, the other curled loosely around a folded printout, the same one he had started the morning with, now outdated, incorrect, and useless.
He turned.
He walked toward Conference C. And I knew exactly what was waiting for him. Because I had drawn the blueprint for this ending months before he ever realized I had stopped answering his emails. At 11:15 sharp, the door to Conference C closed with a soft but definitive sound, sealing behind it the kind of meeting that doesn't get rescheduled, doesn't get live-streamed, doesn't get documented in bullet points on a shared drive, the kind of meeting where people arrive not to present but to listen, where slides remain unopened because no one wants to look at another graph that doesn't match reality, where silence waits at the head of the table like a decision already made. Jared Linwood sat at the end, hands folded neatly in front of him, his expression unreadable but not cold, the face of someone who has survived collapses before and has learned to wait until the debris stops moving before reaching conclusions, while Susan Chong sat 2 seats to his left, already reviewing a printed summary of the vault timeline. The kind of physical document no one wants to hold but everyone insists on having, because reading it on a screen feels too easy to close. Marcus walked in last, holding his original folder like a prop, his step slower now, his confidence dulled at the edges, the practiced rhythm of his movements slightly offbeat, like a song he no longer remembered how to perform, and when he sat down across from Jared, he didn't speak first, not because he was being respectful, but because the room didn't grant him the space. At 11:17, Jared asked the first question, and it wasn't complicated, wasn't technical, wasn't even accusatory. He simply asked, "Have you reviewed the vault?" And Marcus, eyes low, replied after a pause that lasted just a second too long, "Yes, I've read the documents," then added, "I understand the context." But the way he said it made it clear that he understood only what had been obvious, not what had been implied, not what had been recorded between the lines. Susan looked up next, her pen motionless over a page half filled with annotations, and asked, "Do you deny authoring the credential injection logged at 8:26? Her voice even, direct, stripped of all preamble. Marcus shifted in his seat, adjusted the folder, then said, "I don't recall the exact phrasing, but I may have approved an emergency revision under pressure," which didn't answer the question, not entirely, but gave enough ambiguity to stall further certainty, though it did not create any doubt. At 11:20, Jared leaned back slightly and asked another question, this one slower. "And the rollback conditions that were marked skipped at 8:32? Marcus hesitated again, then said, "I was told it wasn't critical," and this time no one looked at each other. No one nodded. No one scribbled a note or tapped a keyboard, because the truth wasn't in what he said. It was in the gaps between what he claimed to remember and what the archive had already written down. The legal advisor, who had until now sat quiet and still just left of center, finally spoke, her tone measured but final. "Those entries were not automated," she said. "They required active confirmation." Marcus didn't respond. Instead, he lowered his eyes again, hands clasped now around the edge of his folder, like he was bracing for something heavier than correction. At 11:24, Jared closed the page he was holding and said, "We'll be following up." No edge in his voice, no raised tone, just the clean-cut dismissal of a man who no longer needed explanation, and Marcus, to his credit, didn't argue, didn't defend, didn't lean forward to offer one more version of what happened. He simply nodded once, stood slowly, gathered his papers, and left the room without another word. He didn't slam the door. He didn't look back. And he didn't take the elevator. At 11:27, the meeting continued without him, this time not to address what went wrong, but to answer the real question that had been hanging quietly in the margins of every conversation since the first red light blinked on the scanner. What happens now? Jared waited for silence, then said, "The system is still active," and Susan followed with, "It's functional, but it's holding," which led to a long pause before the legal advisor added, "And we don't have access to reauthorize it." That was the moment they said my name. Not in passing, not in regret, but as the only way forward. At 11:30, Susan looked down once, then up, her voice steadier than I remembered. "We'll need to reach out." There were no objections. There was no hesitation. Because the system had made it clear, it wasn't waiting for another Marcus. It was waiting for its architect. At 11:33, a message was drafted by Susan herself. No assistance, no delegated phrasing, just her typing quietly into a secure session with her initials logged in the header and the timestamp verified by System C's legacy clock, because if they were going to ask me to return, they would have to acknowledge that I had never truly left. By 11:36, that message had been sent, not to my inbox because that had been deleted, but to the backdoor comms relay I had quietly left connected through a personal certificate buried under the device registry, tagged with a name only I would recognize and a phrase only I would open. The subject line was short. No branding. No banner. Just 4 words. "We'd like to talk." At 11:38, my device buzzed once. No chime. No alert. Just a soft pulse. And I looked down, read the message, and waited, not because I needed time to think, but because I wanted them to sit in the silence just a little longer. They had erased me, but the system remembered. And now, they would have to ask. At 11:40, I opened the message without replying, letting the text sit quietly on my screen while the world outside continued its practiced rhythm, delivery trucks idling at red lights, 2 students crossing the street with earbuds in, a barista wiping the same section of counter for the 3rd time, as I read the words again, not because they were unclear, but because clarity delivered too late always feels like apology in disguise. Susan had written it cleanly, as I expected she would, without pleading, without hedging, stating only that the board had reviewed the archive, acknowledged the events of the morning, and requested a conversation regarding the future of the system, not to reinstate me under old titles or contracts, but to explore, in her phrasing, the possibility of forward collaboration under new conditions. At 11:43, I took one final look across the street at the 5th floor where the pace had slowed to a crawl, where chairs were no longer wheeling back and forth with urgency, where screens remained open but untouched, and where the confidence that once moved between desks like electric current had now been replaced by something quieter, heavier, something that looked more like doubt and less like strategy. I closed my laptop, stood up without finishing my drink, and walked out of the cafe with my coat folded over one arm, letting the early afternoon light hit my face as I crossed the street without rushing, badge still clipped to the inside of my bag, phone silent, step even, passing through the lobby of the building without a word until I reached the security desk where the new guard didn't recognize me but hesitated anyway, perhaps sensing in my expression that whatever clearance he was missing had already been overwritten by something older than the schedule on his clipboard. I nodded once. He buzzed me through. No questions asked. At 11:48, I stepped into the elevator alone, the overhead light humming faintly as the floor numbers climbed, and I didn't touch my phone, didn't check my watch, didn't rehearse any sentences, because whatever needed to be said next was mine to prepare. At 11:50, the elevator doors opened to the 5th floor, and I walked into the hallway that had once felt like a second home, and now felt like a quiet reconstruction of everything I had left behind, the walls freshly painted, but still holding the same blueprint, the same long rows of glass panels, the same light static of a floor trying to pretend nothing had broken. Susan was waiting outside Conference C. No one else. Just her. She didn't offer a smile. She didn't move forward. She simply said, "Thank you for coming," and stepped aside so I could walk in first, the door closing behind us with that same soft click I had heard earlier, but now it felt different. Not like a seal, but like a shift. At 11:52, Jared looked up from a folder and gestured toward the open seat at the end of the table. Not a command. Not an invitation. Just space. I sat. No notes. No briefcase. No title. At 11:53, the legal advisor repeated her earlier statement for the record. The archive confirms the system is fully functional but locked in fallback. I didn't reply.
Not yet.
I let the silence expand. Susan spoke next, her hands folded in front of her, her voice even. "We're not asking you to come back under your previous role." She paused, waiting for any reaction. I gave none. She continued. "We're asking if you'll consider leading the rebuild. On your terms." Jared added, "You know the system better than anyone, not just how it runs, but how it fails when the wrong people touch it." He looked at me then, not as a formality, but as acknowledgement. "We don't want you to return to what was. We want you to own what's next." At 11:55, I leaned forward, slowly, placing both hands on the table, and I said 3 things, each one deliberate, each one spaced to let the silence do its work. First, Marcus's name doesn't appear on anything I build, not in logs, not in team threads, not in acknowledgements or sign-offs or shared credits. You want this clean, keep it clean. They both nodded. Second, no one who stood by while I was erased works with me now. I'm not asking you to fire them. I'm asking you to keep them away. Jared wrote that down himself. Third, I don't rebuild what failed. I build what replaces it. My architecture, not yours. You want access, you lease it. I name it. I write it. I hold the keys. Silence again. Then Jared leaned back and said one word. Understood. No negotiation. No edit. Just clarity. At 11:58, Susan stood, extended a plain envelope across the table. Not a contract, not a check, just a clean device setup, newly registered, with no existing credentials, no inherited frameworks, just a blank slate and a note paper-clipped to the top. I opened it. Read it once. 5 handwritten words in clean block print. You're live. Build it forward. At 12 o'clock, I walked out of the room without shaking hands, without saying goodbye, without offering anyone a smile they hadn't earned, the envelope tucked beneath my arm, the door closing quietly behind me as the floor fell back into that heavy stillness that follows when a structure finally acknowledges the weight of its own collapse. They had expected silence. They had built for obedience. But what they got instead was alignment. At 12:04, I returned to the same apartment I had left that morning without knowing exactly what kind of echo I would be stepping into, my shoes clicking softly on the hardwood as I walked down the narrow hallway with the envelope still under my arm and the weight of the morning's unraveling not pressing on my shoulders but humming beneath my skin like a frequency only I could hear. The kind that doesn't speak in words but in architecture, interlocking decisions, nested permissions, silent systems that hold everything together until the person who understood them is gone. I set the envelope on the kitchen table, untouched, unopened again, even though I already knew what was inside, an unregistered device, a clean terminal, a framework waiting for a name, for a voice, for a command that could not be copied or cloned or extracted from documentation, because the code wasn't just about syntax or logic or infrastructure, it was about authorship. At 12:06, I sat down slowly, opened the lid of the device, and watched the screen come to life, blank and waiting, a quiet invitation rather than a demand, the soft hum of readiness pulsing just beneath the keyboard like breath beneath skin. There were no preset folders, no system scripts, no tokens carried over, no admin fingerprints besides mine. And that was the condition. That was always the condition. At 12:08, I opened a terminal window and didn't type immediately. I let the screen glow for a while, fingers hovering, the way they always do when the next move is too important to rush, not because of the technical implications, but because once the first line is written, everything that follows must live inside the integrity of that opening pulse. The cursor blinked. The silence waited. And somewhere, across the city, I knew that building was still holding its breath. Not broken. Not screaming. Just waiting. At 12:10, I typed the first command, not a name, not a structure, but a query. Who_am_I, and the terminal returned a single word in response, the default placeholder for root access. Owner. No timestamps. No log trails. Just access.
And that was enough.
At 12:12, I began to write, not a script, not a rebuild, but a signature, the scaffolding of a new system that would not rely on permissions granted by committee or overwritten by people who mistook visibility for contribution, the kind of structure that learns not who has power, but who shows up when no one is watching, who waits when the room empties, who holds the system steady through storms no one else sees coming. By 12:15, the foundation was set. No shared drives. No inherited branches. Just one core process, bound to a single immutable condition. No access without authorship. And I meant every syllable of it. At 12:17, my phone buzzed once, not with a message, not with a call, but with a quiet system alert, one I had set up long ago, connected only to a private server that tracked mirrored queries back to my old credentials, a signal that told me someone inside Company A was still trying to access the archive, still trying to reroute something, still trying to write over a record that was never theirs to hold. I didn't respond. I didn't stop typing. Because this wasn't about stopping them anymore. It was about showing what could be built when control didn't come from titles or promotions or who was invited to stand behind the whiteboard at quarterly meetings, but from who kept the lights on in the system's memory, even after the badge was deactivated. At 12:20, I gave the environment a name, not mine, not the company's, but the name of the line that had kept the loop sealed, that had triggered the archive, that had rewritten the center of power inside the system without ever breaking a single rule. I typed it slowly. Integrity. Found at 12:22, I pushed the first update. No fanfare. No alert. Just a heartbeat. New rhythm. New key. Same architect. And on the other side of the network, the ghost, the one they had tried to silence with status reports and dashboards and meetings full of confident phrases, stirred for the first time in hours, its waiting thread finally receiving a signal it recognized, not because it was formatted correctly, but because it was real. At 12:25, the new environment went live. It didn't announce itself. It didn't overwrite anything. It simply began listening. And what it heard was silence. The kind that follows when a building stops pretending and starts learning again. The kind that only answers to the one who built it. At exactly 12:27, the system across the city responded, not with an alert, not with an error, not with a dramatic shift that would draw attention to itself, but with a subtle change in rhythm that only someone who had watched its pulse long enough could feel, a difference in latency that wasn't measurable in milliseconds but in intent, a kind of acknowledgement that something real had touched the grid again after hours of simulations, rerouted commands, and ghost approvals that never truly landed. I sat with my hands resting on either side of the keyboard, not typing now, just watching, just waiting as the metrics came back, not in charts or visuals or green lights, but in behavior, in the quiet way the network began to reroute around outdated credentials, dropping their priority beneath the new baseline I had just defined, clearing room for the system to breathe again under rules that weren't just secure, they were honest. At 12:30, the first external ping arrived from Company A's remaining node, a handshake request wrapped in outdated protocol, trying to validate access through a signature I hadn't used in over a year, and when the system refused the connection, it didn't log it as failure, it logged it as history. Because it wasn't a threat, it was a reminder. That access meant nothing without authorship. At 12:33, a second message came through, not a query but a flag, a process triggered automatically from within their still-running infrastructure, alerting them that a new process had gone live, that a new environment was drawing power, and that it matched none of the known templates still listed in their deployment directory. The message was routed to a shared inbox, Operations Core, but it was read by only one person, someone who had sat silently at the edge of the 5th floor all morning, someone who had watched everything without speaking, without intervening, someone who had, in fact, stayed invisible by choice since the moment my badge had failed on Monday morning.
Lyle.
The coordinator from finance. He had clicked the archive first. He had opened every page. He had seen what happened not just in data, but in tone, in timestamps, in message trails that didn't align with outcomes, in approvals that were never verified but were still executed, in silent shifts where every mistake was smoothed over in real time and counted as experience afterward. At 12:35, Lal sent one message. It went to no group. It was not CC'd. It was sent directly to the new environment ID. The subject line was blank. The message body had only one line. It should have been you all along. I read it once, then archived it. Not because it wasn't worth keeping, but because it didn't need to be replied to. At 12:37, Company A's route scheduler attempted to sync again, not aggressively, just habitually, the way a clock checks itself against a server it no longer trusts, and when it reached my new environment, the reply it received wasn't a denial or a rejection, it was a mirror, one that reflected back its request with perfect syntax and zero data, forcing it to confront its own vacancy. No status. No success.
Just stillness.
At 12:39, I pushed the second update, not a full framework, not even a prototype, just a set of new variables embedded into the base code. Conditions for trust, thresholds for erasure, logging parameters tied to behavior rather than identity, because I had learned the hard way that systems fail not when they break, but when they're handed to people who think being in the room means they understand the floor beneath their feet. By 12:42, the first internal tracker inside Company A marked the update as unclassified activity, a label usually reserved for third-party tools or unauthorized testing environments, and while it wasn't flagged as malicious, it triggered a silent escalation to a panel of 3 security leads who hadn't been involved in the events of the morning and were now seeing, for the first time, a structure operating on the same server cluster, but outside their known schema. At 12:45, they tried to trace it, but they couldn't, because I hadn't buried the architecture. I had removed the doors. Nothing to break in. Nothing to brute force. Only truth. At 12:47, a sync request returned to their logs with a message that read, version mismatch. Source invalid. Confirm authorship to proceed. The string wasn't mine. The system wrote it itself. That was the last piece I had built into the loop, the ability not just to wait for me, but to evolve under the assumption that if it couldn't trust who touched it, it wouldn't touch back. At 12:50, I began assembling the access tier, not admin panels, not passwords, not approval chains, but identity bridges built on contribution rather than title, with every permission gated behind one question. Did you build this? If the answer was no, then the system would hold its breath again. If the answer was yes, it would listen. But only once. At 12:53, I sat back, looked at what was taking shape, and let the silence stretch across the apartment like a shadow returning to a room after the sun moves behind the buildings, soft but total, and I understood finally that this wasn't a rebuild, it was a boundary. At 12:55, I closed the terminal. Not to stop working, but to let the structure stand on its own. No crutches. No mirrors. Just function. Because when you build something that understands who it belongs to, it doesn't just work. It waits. At 12:58, as the city moved into the slow churn of early afternoon and the high-glass buildings shed their reflections onto pavement too hot to linger on, I sat in the stillness of my apartment with the new environment live, the vault closed, and the silence returned, not hollow, not final, but full in the way that only systems made with intention can be, like a quiet machine humming under the floorboards of a structure that had finally stopped pretending it understood how to hold itself together. Outside, a delivery van idled at the corner, the kind with a back door that always slams too hard, and a woman in a mustard-colored blazer walked past holding her phone like a compass, her earbuds in, her eyes never once lifting to the building that had held my name without speaking it, not on the wall, not on the door, but in the walls themselves, in the space where every line of logic I had left behind had waited like a heartbeat misaligned until the exact moment it heard me return. At 1 o'clock, I opened a new file, not because I had a plan for what would go inside it yet, but because some structures don't begin with outlines or architecture, they begin with space, with the allowance of something new to take shape inside something old that no longer holds the same weight, and I watched the cursor blink once, twice, and then settle into rhythm. I began to sketch, not in code but in behavior, a new process flow that wasn't designed for scale or speed but for integrity, where actions were only validated when they originated from someone who could trace their decisions back to something they had written themselves, not in a meeting, not in a status update, but in the silent hours between deployments, when no one else was watching and every variable mattered. At 1:03, a new ping came through, this one from a private address, routed through the same internal thread Marcus once used to send his commands to my old system, the kind of line that shouldn't have still been active unless someone had forgotten to cut it, or unless someone had chosen not to. The message was short, not anonymous, not encrypted, just one name in the sender field.
Lyle.
The subject line was blank again. The message body contained 8 words. If you build it, I'm still here. I read it, then let it sit. At 1:05, the system confirmed that all known Company A environments had ceased pushing changes into the mirrored fallback, which meant someone had finally stopped pretending to fix what couldn't be touched without unraveling, and that someone had either realized the truth or had been told by someone who did. At 1:07, the last of the legacy dashboards at Company A still connected to the ghost environment blinked once, not with an error, but with an expiration notice, custom-coded, bound to the closure of my vault, carrying one line across the top banner in gray. Structure retired. Connection terminated. Please author your own. The phrase wasn't loud. It wasn't even highlighted. But everyone who read it knew exactly what it meant. At 1:10, I opened the access log of my new environment and watched as a fresh request arrived, not from Company A's infrastructure, but from an external security auditor whose credentials I recognized from a file review I had denied months before my departure, a name tied to a process that once tried to justify deleting 2 months of backend logs in favor of streamlined retention. The request asked for insight. The system replied with nothing, because I had taught it not to explain. I had taught it to wait. At 1:13, a second message came in from Susan, not through corporate email, but through a personal relay, clean and formatted, written like someone who had finally stepped out from behind a role that had kept her too quiet too long. She wrote, "I've shut it down. The mirrors. The fake green lights. All of it." Then she added, "We're not rebuilding the old structure. We're making room. And finally, tell us what it looks like." I didn't answer immediately. Not because I didn't want to, but because I wasn't ready to be asked. Not again. Not yet. At 1:15, the loop completed its final check. No anomalies. No alerts. No remaining threads pretending to be operational. And then, without ceremony, it powered itself down. Not because it had failed, but because it had finished. I watched the indicator fade from my screen like a light going out in a house I no longer lived in, and I didn't feel victory or satisfaction or even release. What I felt was alignment. At 1:18, I closed the lid on the new terminal, stood, stretched, listened to the windows shift slightly in their frames as the wind changed direction, carrying with it the sound of a city that had never stopped moving, even when systems froze and rooms went quiet. By 1:20, no one was trying to reach me.
No one needed to.
Because everything that needed to be said had already been written, in the logs, in the silence, in the structure that remembered who had authored it. And the structure? It was still listening. At 1:25, the air inside the apartment had begun to shift, warmed slightly by the daylight that filtered through the west-facing windows, casting a long stretch of golden light across the wood floor where the edge of the envelope still rested, untouched since I returned but no longer carrying the weight of decision, only the quiet residue of what had already passed, choices made, structures dismantled, silence honored. I walked slowly to the far end of the room, opened the window just wide enough to let the breeze roll in, and stood with my palms resting on the sill, letting the faint sounds of the city below drift upward, horns in the distance, footsteps echoing in alleyways, conversations blurred into soft, shapeless vowels, and I let it all wash over me like a reminder that the world keeps going, even when something as foundational as trust is removed and rebuilt from the ground up. By 1:30, no screens were open, no alerts were blinking, no meetings were pending, and no one was watching, which meant this moment belonged to no one but me. Not a company, not a system, not a boardroom full of people finally asking the right questions, but only me and the quiet machine I had given a name and a voice and a memory long before anyone thought it would matter. I walked back to the kitchen slowly, filled a glass with water, and sat down at the table again, not because I had more work to do, but because endings are never really about stopping, they're about slowing, about letting the pace ease until the movement becomes reflection, until the noise recedes into the shape it came from, leaving only what mattered. I thought about the first time I wrote a system that answered only to me, not out of ego, not out of control, but because I needed to know that if everything else around it failed, one thing would still be standing, unshaken, unbought, unclaimed by anyone who didn't understand its roots. At 1:34, I opened a notebook and wrote a single line, not a plan, not a statement, but a promise, just 7 words in ink across a clean white page. Some systems are not built to forget. I closed the notebook gently, set it aside, and breathed. Outside, the sky was turning the kind of pale blue that only appears on the edge of winter, cool and endless and just slightly translucent, like the system I had just closed, like the one I had just begun, like the version of myself that no longer needed to fight to be seen. I wasn't gone. I wasn't erased. I had simply waited. And when the silence was finally undeniable, I answered. Not with vengeance. Not with noise. But with structure. And that, in the end, was louder than anything they ever said.